In the last clips, we looked at the broader picture of the history of international cooperation, and in this one we look briefly at the establishment of the United Nations itself. It was an idea of the US government during World War II, but was developed and established through cooperation with Great Britain and the other Allied powers. That was the genesis, but the formal establishment was done through international conferences at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944 and San Francisco in 1945. This clip also examines debates at San Francisco about the content of the Charter and concludes with the preamble to the Charter. It's a very cursory glance. If you want further details, there are whole books written on the topic which give more insight into the politics of the UN. Plus, the UN itself has a history of the key events and issues on its website under the About UN tab, and then click on History, though there's not a whole lot there on the politics. The US was the key force in the establishment of the UN, which was at a number of levels surprising given its pre-war isolationism and late entry to World War II. Well before then, the British were trying to encourage US participation on the side of the Allies, or at least their undivided support for them, which they finally got in August 1941 with the signing of the Atlantic Charter. But the Charter didn't commit to the establishment of an international organisation. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 further solidified Allied cooperation. It was President Franklin D. Roosevelt who came up with the term United Nations during a visit by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. There's a bit of a funny story here. Apparently FDR was so excited about his idea for the name that as soon as he finished breakfast, he was wheeled into Churchill's bedroom and went in even though there was no answer to his knock. He waited for Churchill, who came out of the bathroom quite naked. FDR just pointed and said, "The United Nations." Churchill responded, "Good." At this time, the British and Americans were actually using the term United Nations to refer to the Allies of World War II. So this was the meaning of the term at its first public outing in the Declaration by the United Nations, which was signed by 26 countries on the 1st of January 1942. The idea of a new post-war organisation to maintain peace and security was first publicly declared at the Moscow Conference on the 30th of October 1943. It was signed by the governments of the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States and China. That goal was reaffirmed at the meeting of the leaders of the US, the USSR and the UK at Tehran on the 1st of December 1943. The blueprint of the United Nations was prepared at a conference held at a mansion known as Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. They worked from US proposals. The UK were actually surprised by the extent of US planning for the organisation, but maybe it was because the British couldn't see their relative decline and the US did see the rise of their own global hegemonic power. The State Department had begun their planning on the UN in 1941, as well as for an organisation to manage the post-war financial and trade system. Did you know that the Bretton Woods Conference, formerly known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, took place before Dumbarton Oaks in July 1944? This was the conference that created the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Dumbarton Oaks was a business-like meeting of the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union and China at a private mansion in Washington. The picture shows the opening sessions in the music room. The meeting ran from the 21st of September through to the 7th of October 1944, and here the aims, structure and functioning of a world organisation were agreed, and then after presented to the peoples of all countries for them to consider and discuss. The key dilemmas for the Big Five at Dumbarton Oaks were the same as those faced by creators of the League of Nations. The key dilemmas for the Big Five at Dumbarton Oaks were the same as those faced by the creators of the League of Nations, namely, how to create an organisation that guaranteed peace, and how to balance national sovereignty, the power differentials of the range of countries across the globe, and the desire for international peace. Regarding the power differentials, the US answer was veto power for the 5 founding members of the United Nations, the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, China, and France. This meant that the organisation wouldn't make any calls that they felt weren't in line with their interest. The veto was initially a US idea, but the Soviet Union quickly became committed to it, though for slightly different reasons. In the end, of course, all the Big Five came to support the idea. Thus, while the General Assembly promotes equal representation, the Security Council has veto power, and it is the organisation with the real power, and there is no pretense of equal voice. Despite the discrediting of the League of Nations, the United Nations adopted many of the same principles and a similar structure as the League. But there are a couple of major differences. First, the UN gives greater emphasis to economic and social cooperation. Remember in the last clip, I talked about the failure of the League to respond to the Great Depression and what a major crisis it was. And that was a key reason for the emphasis on economic cooperation. Second, the UN Charter takes a broader approach to the definition of international security than the League did. On the 25th of April 1945, delegates of 50 nations met at San Francisco for the United Nations Conference on International Organization. These nations were the nations that had declared war on Germany and Japan and had subscribed to the United Nations declarations. In other words, it was mostly the already industrialized countries, or what we sometimes call the Global North, that were represented. But there were a few Latin American states, and there were a number of states that were actually still under colonial rule, like India, Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Philippines. So there were a large number of still colonized nations not represented. Remember, as of 2015, the United Nations had 193 member states, not just 50. If you think of the representation in terms of the emerging Cold War politics, 35 of the states there were aligned to the US, 5 to the Soviet Union, and there were 10 non-aligned nations. There were 3,500 people there as delegates, staff, advisors, and in the secretariat, plus over 2,500 press, radio, and newsreel representatives and observers from different corners of the globe. It was up to that time probably the largest international conference ever held, though it pales in comparison to some of the conferences today. For example, the Rio +20 United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development had 192 countries represented and had many thousands of official participants and an estimated further 50,000 people involved in the civil society forum that ran parallel to the conference. The Charter was divided into 4 sections, and each section was drafted by a commission. The commission reported to an executive committee that comprised the heads of all 50 delegations. However, a 50-member executive committee was too unwieldy, so a 14-member steering committee was established, also made up of the heads of delegations, and it prepared the recommendations for the executive committee. Even though the World War II allies, or really the US, had provided the draft charter for the United Nations that formed the basis of the negotiations, there was still a lot of debate at San Francisco. As Phyllis Bennis said in a book titled Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates the United Nations Today, written in 2000, behind the high-minded phrasing was the hardball world of diplomatic power plays and forced reluctant compromises. Some of the governments in Washington, London, Moscow, and Paris had goals in mind far more primitive than world peace and shared equal development. For the Allied powers, the goal was to ensure, through diplomatic means, that the governments that had won the war would continue to rule the post-war peace, unquote. We now know that the US even bugged the offices and rooms of the delegations and even of their own allies. So there were quite a few debates at San Francisco. Here's a few of the more prominent ones. One issue was the status of regional organisations. Many countries already had their own arrangements for regional defence and mutual assistance, so the question was, how were these arrangements to be related to the UN? The conference decided to give them a role in the peaceful settlement of disputes, and also in some circumstances in enforcement measures, but only where the aims and acts of those groups accorded with the aims and purposes of the United Nations. Another issue was that the League of Nations had provided a mechanism for the revision of treaties between members, should the UN make similar provisions. Here it was agreed that rather than provide machinery for treaty revision, treaties made after the formation of the United Nations would simply be registered with the United Nations Secretariat and published by it. A new chapter was added in San Francisco on a topic not in the draft that came out of Dumbarton Oaks, namely the system for territories placed under UN trusteeship. This was a matter that generated much debate. The League of Nations had a system that said there were some trustee territories that could gain independence relatively quickly, some that would take a lot longer, and in its Eurocentric arrogance, some that would never be capable of self-government or independence. In the end, the Charter recommended that the promotion of the progressive development of the peoples of trust territories should be directed toward independence or self-government. Remember, trusteeship was only for colonies of the losers of world wars, although territories could be voluntarily placed under UN trusteeship. The Trusteeship Council's operations were suspended on the 1st of November 1994 with the independence of Palau, which was then the last remaining UN trust territory. There was also debate about the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. The conference decided that member nations wouldn't be compelled to accept the court's jurisdiction, but might voluntarily accept compulsory jurisdiction. The most hotly debated topic was the right of veto of the Big Five on action by the powerful Security Council. We know how it was resolved because the Big Five are the Permanent Five, or P5 for short, on the Security Council. At one point, the conflict of opinion on this question threatened to break up the conference. The smaller powers were concerned that if one of the Big Five were threatening the peace, the Security Council would be powerless to act, which we arguably saw most recently with the 2003 US decision to invade Iraq. The smaller powers were also concerned that in the case of a clash between two non-permanent members of the Security Council, the P5 could act arbitrarily. The smaller powers debated the need for the veto and sought to have its power reduced, but the P5 insisted on this provision and argued that the main responsibility for maintaining world peace would fall most heavily on them. In the end, the smaller powers conceded in the interests of maintaining the United Nations. So compromises were made, and the 111-article charter was finalised and adopted unanimously on the 25th of June 1945 at the San Francisco Opera House. The next day, they signed it at the Herbst Theatre Auditorium of the Veterans War Memorial Building in San Francisco. This is Francis Michael Ford MP, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, signing the UN Charter at that ceremony. The United Nations did not come into existence at the signing of the Charter. In many countries, the Charter had to be approved by their congresses or parliaments. It had therefore been provided that the Charter would come into force when the governments of China, France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union and the United States, and a majority of the other signatories, had ratified it and deposited notification to this effect with the State Department in the US. On the 24th of October, that condition was filled and the United Nations came into existence. The preamble of the United Nations Charter is still inspiring to read to this day. It says, "We the people of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for these ends to practice tolerance and to live together in peace with one another as good neighbours, and to unite our strength and maintain international peace and security, and to ensure that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims."